Institute for the Study of Societal Issues here on the Berkeley campus, where we are the sponsor of today's talk. We also have some co-sponsors I want to thank: the Center for Race and Gender, the Beatrice Bain Research Group, the Gender and Women's Studies Department, and the Religion, Politics, and Globalization Program, who have all helped in organizing and publicizing the event. I would also like to announce an upcoming event the center has planned that may be of some interest to you. On Thursday, March 11th, from 4 to 5:30 in this room, Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of Pittsburgh, Kathleen Blee, who is a renowned ethnographer and scholar of women in organized hate groups, will present a talk entitled, "Does Gender Matter in Organized Racism?" I hope many of you will be able to attend that. There's a sign-in sheet being passed around. Please put your, sign in and include your email address, and that way you can keep up with further events. Okay, our speakers today are Michelle Goldberg and Carole Joffe. Michelle is a journalist and author based in Brooklyn. Her most recent book is The Means of Reproduction, excuse me. Wow. Caught back in an earlier incarnation of myself. Okay. The Means of Reproduction, Sex, Power, and the Future of the World, which was published in April 2009 by Penguin Press and won last year's J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Award. Goldberg is also the author of the New York Times bestseller Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism. She's a columnist for the Daily Beast and a senior correspondent for the American Prospect. Her work has appeared in the New Republic, The Nation, Glamour, the Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. Michelle received a master's in journalism here in Berkeley in 1998. Carole Joffe is Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of California, Davis, and a visiting professor at the UCSF Bixby Center for Global Reproductive Health. Her research focuses on the social dimensions of reproductive health, with a particular interest in abortion provision. She's the author of Doctors of Conscience, The Struggle to Provide Abortion Before and After Roe v. Wade, and The Regulation of Sexuality, Experiences of Family Planning Workers. She had numerous articles and a serious track record as a public intellectual, publishing her work in both academic and lay media. She has recently completed the book Dispatches from the Abortion Wars, The Cost of Fanaticism to Doctors and Patients and the Rest of Us. Each of the speakers will take about 25 minutes, and after which we'll open things up for discussion. I'd like to end at about 1:20 to give people the opportunity to buy the books, which are available over here, and Carole and Michelle will be available to autograph them. By way of introduction, watching last night's State of the Union, it was hard not to be struck by the change in political climate in this country over the past year. If you think back to last January, it was not only the exhilaration of the extraordinary breakthrough the presidency of Barack Obama represented, but also a kind of sense of relief among many people at what seemed to be the eclipse of right-wing domination of our politics and national discourse. Of course, in the back of the mind, there were also some unsettling images from the McCain-Palin campaign. Above all, crowds at the Palin rallies suggesting an angry willingness to dismiss Obama's legitimacy at all costs, shouts of things like he's a Muslim, to say nothing of threats of violence. But even with that as a prelude, what's happened this year has been a surprise. In effect, the voices in those Palin rallies have turned into a movement, which has managed to insert a kind of revitalized hard-right channel right back into the center of our political discourse. Not only that, but groups like the Tea Partiers and much of the popular media see the political momentum on their side, assigning them, for example, responsibility for the recent electoral upset in Massachusetts. and the edge of violence from the Palin rallies has not abated. Examples of this abound. To pick one, a poster at the most recent anti-healthcare rally in Washington that had it, "We came unarmed, this time." As the killing of Dr. George Tiller in Kansas reminds us, when fanaticism is on the rise, the cutting edge of its acting out is frequently in the abortion wars. This makes the work of our two authors today particularly vital. Carole Joffe's book is a keenly observed view of the state of intimidation through confrontation, through law, and through everyday harassment on a stunning variety of levels faced by women and service providers in this country. Michelle Goldberg tells a tale which may be a good deal less familiar to us. She documents how the American right has exported its abortion wars abroad. Plus, she alerts us to sort of homegrown developments in some other countries which are sometimes quite startling and add extraordinary dimensions to the difficulties that women face in those countries. And with that, let me turn things over to Carole. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, Larry. It's a really great pleasure to be here, and I want to congratulate Larry and Christine and the rest of us to plagiarize my own title, which was actually plagiarized from the Mother Jones logo. That's another story. Anyway, I want to congratulate all of us at this university on the launch of this center. I think, like many good ideas, once it happens, one raises the issue, well, how could you have a first-class university at Berkeley and not have a center that looks at this kind of issue? So I'm just truly delighted to be both on the board of the center and today to be a presenter. And I also want to say how delighted I am to be on a panel with my colleague, Michelle Goldberg, who has done such phenomenal work in this field. Today she'll be talking about her current book, and you can buy it. Her first book, Kingdom Coming, is just fantastic. I who try to read everything I can about the domestic American right, didn't find anything better, so I strongly recommend that to you. Okay, today what I'd like to do is mainly give you a sense of what's going on in the trenches in the world of abortion provision, particularly since the tragic assassination of Dr. Tiller last May. I'm going to start with two visuals. My journalist daughter has explained to me how important multimedia is, and I get it. Although she hasn't explained to me how to do it, so I'm going to ask Christine to help me. The first thing I'm going to show you, and I'll get out of the way, is a 2.5-minute YouTube video on YouTube. The gentleman you're going to see, the gentleman, I'm being very kind here, is someone called Flip Benham, one of the leading anti-abortion extremists. His claim to fame, among other things, was he was the guy who converted Norma McCorvey to his side. He is one of the most, as you will see, one of the most belligerent, aggressive people in this field. At one point, he was head of Operation Rescue, no longer is. Anyway, so.
Like all healthcare patients, you deserve privacy and respect. And once inside, privacy and respect is yours. But standing in the way of your privacy are sidewalk bullies. Rather than your right to privacy, you are subjected to their right to free speech, their right to push their religion on you. Using scaffolding and amplification, these bullies harass women in the name of Jesus.
Yes, that child is dangling on the thin thread of your choice.
They tell awful lies and even threaten death.
And we've been promised that the gates of hell, that would be the place that you're walking in right now, where Satan dwells, where he's going to drink the blood of your child. We're not your enemy. We're not the one that hates you. No, the people in there are the ones that hate you. They have hate speech, but it's all candy-coated and looking real pretty on the outside, but it's going to lead to your death.
Charlotte, North Carolina, is this the way you treat women? Enough. Basta. Stop sidewalk bullying at women's clinics.
what's interesting about Flip Benham, the person you saw, is that, I mean, you didn't see it in this clip, but in much of his activity, he brings in a trio of things he hates. He hates abortion, he hates gays, and the two hatreds very often go together. A more recent development is he's brought Islam into his hatred trio. In fact, Michelle wrote a very good piece a few years ago discussing how he tried to get a permit so he could burn a Quran at a rally against an abortion clinic. The two do not seem to have an immediate connection, but, or at least for most of us. Another thing that this Flip Benham incident shows us is a tactic used by some of the most extremist groups, and that is to literally move to the city where they want to shut down a clinic. So just as Operation Rescue moved to Wichita, Kansas for several years before ultimately Dr. Tiller was killed, Flip Benham and his followers have moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where you saw that. And they're basically, their day job is to try to shut down this clinic. So far they have not succeeded, but they really do make life miserable for the people who work there. And I think part of what keeps me studying this field for many years, 30 and counting, is I still don't get how people can keep doing it. I mean, on an intellectual level, I do get it, and I've written about it, or I've tried to. Emotionally, I don't understand how people can put up with what these people put up with. Which brings me to my next visual. And this is, what you're seeing here are wanted posters. These are recent developments after the killing of Dr. Killer. You can't see the slides very well, and those are not real names. I mean, the original posters have real names. I asked my research assistant I don't know if she, wasn't Joseph Smith the guy who found the morning? I don't know if that was delivered or not, whatever, fine with me. Anyway, these posters were left outside. I'm not sure you can tell. The two faces are actually African American doctors. This is significant because there's 4 doctors who work at this particular clinic in Charlotte. 2 are African American, 2 are white. The wanted posters target only the African Americans, which itself is interesting and can be interpreted in a couple different ways. But I want to give you a little background. On these posters. These posters have a very important place in the history of the anti-abortion movement. About 10 years ago, in the 90s, the 9th District Court of California, and then later the Supreme Court, upheld a finding that this is not these posters, but that the posters that were made available in Portland, targeting a bunch of doctors in Portland. Oh, thank you. And how district 8? District 8. Okay. Some doctors brought suit, went through the courts. The courts found that wanted posters were not protected free speech because they were seen. The court decided that they were an incitement to violence. Further backstory is there's a website called the Nuremberg Files. Has anybody here ever been to that website? Those of you who have laptops, if anybody does, go. It's quite an adventure. You'll see dripping blood, the names of abortion providers. One category is blood flunkies and spouses. I won't say proud, I am amused to find myself there as a blood flunky. This website would post the names and addresses, often pictures of abortion providers. When an abortion provider was wounded, there would be the name would appear in gray. When an abortion provider was killed, and three of the 8 abortion doctors who'd been killed actually were on this website, a line was stricken through their names. The court decided that this is incitement to violence. The website has not been taken down, but the person who maintains the website doesn't add new names, and there's no more stricken lines. Anyway, these posters are the first, which appeared just recently, are the first instance of the reappearance of wanted posters. Their purpose, obviously, is to intimidate. Legally, they probably would pass a test of legality, given that they are just telling to stop killing babies. They're not telling other people to kill them. But I mean, the purpose can only be interpreted as intimidation. Sorry, that's okay. Okay, to give you just a sense of what providers have been putting up with for years, let me read you just a brief portion from my book. In this chapter, I'm talking about the kind of violent actions to which providers have been subjected to. This concerns anthrax. Just days after the murder of Dr. Barnett Slepian in October 1998, Bart Slepian was a provider in Buffalo, New York, about a dozen abortion clinics in the United States began to receive letters claiming that the powdery white substance enclosed in the envelope was anthrax, and that anyone who opened such a letter would die. Notably, about 80 of these letters were received by clinics before the anthrax attacks that occurred right after the events of September 11th, 2001. All of the anthrax letters sent to abortion clinics ultimately proved to be hoaxes, but the costs in disruption to clinic operations, in resources expended by law enforcement, in the psychological toll on staff, patients, and others, such as mail carriers, was enormous. Over 500 of the total of about 650 of these incidents have been attributed to one anti-abortion extremist, Clayton Wagner, now in jail, while the others remain unsolved. One of the first clinics that received an anthrax threat was a small center that was part of a Planned Parenthood affiliate in the Midwest. Some years after this incident, I spoke with Joe, and this is a pseudonym, still the executive director of that affiliate, and Patty, then the manager of the center that received a threat. I was astonished to learn that this particular center did not even perform abortions. Actually, I wasn't all that astonished, since only about 3% of Planned Parenthood services involve abortion. Adding to the irony, the anthrax threat occurred on a day when the clinic was providing prenatal services. As Patty reminisced, we had started our prenatal care just a few months earlier. We were the only one of that affiliate sites to be doing prenatal, and we were so excited about that, so jazzed. The anthrax incident occurred early on that fateful day. As Patty continued, quote, "We'd get the mail around 9, and we're always cautious if something looked suspicious, but that letter looked okay. Allegra, one of the clinic assistants, opened the mail that morning, and all of a sudden I hear her crying out, quote, 'Oh God, oh God.' So I rushed over, and there was this letter with this powder-like substance in it, and it had a skull and crossbones on it, and it said something like, quote, 'You have been anthrax.' So our adrenaline starts flowing. I immediately get on the phone with Planned Parenthood headquarters and talk with our security director, Dan. Very soon, hazmat people, that's government officials who deal with hazardous materials, very soon hazmat people were there. Cops are everywhere. No one had really ever been around that type of situation before. Once Patty had alerted the main offices of Planned Parenthood of this crisis, immediate efforts were made to contact Joe, the executive director. In the surreal mixture of the extreme and the mundane that seemed to often occur in this world, Joe learned of this incident from a call to her cell phone while she was at a hair salon. Quote, "So there I was, sitting under the dryer, unable to move, knowing that I needed to be there. Back at the center, there was some confusion among authorities as to how to deal with Allegra. She had been immediately isolated from others, but the next steps were not clear. Some of the officials wanted her to strip down and be sprayed and decontaminated right there, while others thought it would be sufficient to take her to a hospital emergency room for such decontamination, which is what ultimately occurred. Joe and Patty remembered that it was not only an extremely terrifying experience, but it was also very humiliating for Allegra. Fortunately, there were only a few patients in the clinic at the time, and they were rescheduled and sent home. Later that day, when lab results confirmed that the anthrax attack was indeed a hoax, the clinic reopened and staff members saw the afternoon patients as planned. Now the anthrax attacks have somewhat quieted down, but other kinds of attacks and disruptions have taken their place. I mean, if you work in an abortion clinic, you never know what to expect. Now, since Dr. Tiller was killed last May, many clinics have reported an upsurge in clinic violence and aggressiveness. These wanted posters being just one example. One thing I've thought a lot about, and I don't really have a good answer to, and perhaps Michelle does, how much of this violence is having the most extremist wing of the anti-abortion movement being revved up, inspired by Scott Roeder, the man who admitted to murdering Dr. Tiller, and how much is just the kind of in-your-face aggressiveness, upsurge in violence, the kind of stuff that Larry spoke about in his introductory remarks, how much is a response to the election of Obama and the kind of aggressiveness that has called forth from many people on the right. I think it's a combination of both. One of the clinics that has gotten one of the clinics that has gotten a very worrisome level of violence is in Allentown, Pennsylvania. We normally think of most of this violence happening in the South or the Midwest. Pennsylvania, liberal East Coast. Although as someone who used to live in Philadelphia, I remember Pennsylvania being described as a state with Pittsburgh at one end, Philadelphia at the other, and Alabama in the middle. So anyway, the Allentown Clinic has been relentlessly picketed and harassed. One of the members of the so-called Army of God, a person who publishes a newsletter that he sends to prisoners in jail for anti-abortion violence, lives very near there, pickets, and so on and so forth. On the day of Dr. Tiller's funeral, actually his funeral was on a Sunday, so that on the day after Dr. Tiller's funeral, an escort was approached by this Army of God person, John Dunkel, and said, "How do you want to die today, bullet or knife?" The director of the clinic, Jen Boulanger, and those of you who are more interested in this can see her, if you go to the Rachel Maddow website, she appeared on the Rachel Maddow show talking about anti-abortion violence after the killing of Dr. Tiller. Also on PBS, either this Friday night or a week from Friday night, there's going to be a special on anti-abortion violence focusing on that clinic. So those of you interested, check your listings. Jen Boulanger was so freaked out by this escort being threatened with death. Another thing she was very upset about, quite understandably, there's a young man in his 20s who's picketed at her clinic since he was a child. She thinks he's a little mentally unstable. Right around the time Dr. Tiller was killed, this young man was heard ranting about ammonium nitrate, which is one of the, as I'm sure you know, which is an explosive. She did a very uncharacteristic thing. Most abortion providers prefer to remain under the radar. She decided she had no choice. She was going to go public. She wrote a very provocative piece published in, among other places, the Huffington Post, and it was called "Come Together to Prevent My Murder." And she basically said, "I'm afraid I'm next. I've been threatened. I would like, I want community support." I'll read just part of her op-ed. Quote, "Like Dr. Tiller, I've been called a baby murderer and other chilling things, including, quote, the bride of Lucifer. My husband and I have been told a family that kills together goes to hell together," end of quote. "The physician who works at my center and I get picketed at our homes monthly by a member of the Army of God, an organization that supports the use of violence to stop abortion and glorifies those who commit acts of murder. People calling themselves Lehigh Valley pro-lifers have targeted my mother, sending her hate mail, shaming her, and accusing her of raising a bad Catholic. I have been told by someone from this same group that I'm going to die soon," end of quote. Now, some good actually did come out of this public statement by her. A Lutheran minister in her town, among other responses, there was a Lutheran minister in her town who, by his own admission, had not thought about abortion much one way or the other and was silent on the subject. But he was so deeply offended that Dr. Tiller got killed while in church, and Dr. Tiller was a fellow Lutheran, that he decided that this can't go on any longer. People like me, a Lutheran minister, cannot be quiet when one of my parishioners is shot down in the lobby of his church. Dr. Tiller, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Tiller that day had been serving as an usher in his church. He and another person who just testified at his trial, at the trial of the murderer, which is literally going on as we speak, were supposedly discussing the quality of the donuts that they were handing out. And Scott Roeder came and shot him in the head, knowing that Dr. Tiller was most likely wearing a bulletproof vest. Getting back to Allentown, this Lutheran minister called together an informal network of clergy. We don't have to agree on abortion. We do have to agree that this kind of violence and intimidation in our community is unacceptable. So there is this informal network. It is deeply comforting to Jen and her staff. Whether it will prevent the next tragedy, who knows? One important thing that has developed in the last couple of years, one important new strategy by the anti-abortion movement that I want to call to your attention is a very aggressive legal strategy that goes along with the kind of harassment you've seen. What various right-wing legal groups have done is bypass. They used to just sue the hell out of the clinics. Now they are bypassing the clinics and very aggressive suits against city government, against against the chief of police in some cases, against the mayor in other cases, basically saying that First Amendment rights of protesters are being interfered with. In a number of cases, cities have been made to do quite substantial cash payouts. For example, in Allentown, very long, complicated story that I don't have time to tell you. In Allentown, the city didn't give a permit to, the protesters asked for a permit, the city didn't give them one, on the other hand didn't stop them from going there. The protesters sued the city, won a $130,000 cash judgment. $10,000 was given to 13 protesters. The protesters used the money to hire private detectives to find out the names of the staff people who worked there. So this is what you call adding insult to injury on steroids. So when staff people came to work, they would say, ha ha, we know where you live, and we used the money we got from the city to find out. So there's been cash payouts in Allentown, in Bellevue, Nebraska, and in a number of cities, and in Charlotte. What this has done, as you might imagine, is dampen the response of police, local police, who by and large, according to every clinic director I've spoken to, who by and large are not sympathetic to the protesters, who don't like people acting out like that. Local police feel very stymied, and they've been told to intervene only if things are really, really out of control. Now, I know we have a number of sociologists in this room, and if the sociology of law has taught us anything, it's the enormous discretion that law officers have, and what does a law mean, how do you implement it, how strictly do you implement it. A very, very serious problem now going on in the clinic community is that many clinics feel that the last line their lifeline, namely that the cops will take care of them when these Looney Tunes really get vicious, that is disappearing, or that feels more fragile, and that's a very serious problem. I just want to end by raising an issue that I think I'm hoping this group and certainly this center will be discussing in the months to come, namely as we see a new right wing coalescing around the so-called Tea Party movement, whose driving force appears to be just hatred of government, and hatred of government. Remember, keep your government out of my Medicare. Remember that. what role will social conservatives, and specifically the anti-abortion movement, play in this new right wing, in this new right wing movement that's shaping up? What role will the extremist anti-abortion movement play? One possible scenario is that I don't think, and I agree with you, Michelle, I read something you recently wrote, that, if I'm understanding you correctly, that you can't have a right wing in this country without the social conservatives. Scott Brown, who was elected last week, actually is nominally pro-choice. I'm talking about the Massachusetts election. He's nominally pro-choice, not as pro-choice as the woman he beat. The National Right to Life Committee supported him. The Tea Party supported him. I don't think this movement can go forward, as Michelle says, I don't think this movement can go forward without the support of the hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of anti-abortion activists. What role there'll be for this kind of extremism remains to be seen. I don't think these people are going to go away. If they don't find some kind of support within the Tea Party movement, they will just do their thing anyway. So thank you very much, and I look forward to discussion.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to the Center, and of course to Carole Joffe, who has been, I'm very flattered to hear her refer to me as a colleague, because I've been aware of her work for a very long time. I'm here to talk about the international scene, but I want to quickly start by following up on something that Carole said, which is about the Tea Party movement and the religious right. I tend to see the Tea Party movement as essentially a continuation of a kind of right-wing populism that goes back even further than, the opposition to FDR. But you can see incredibly close parallels between the Tea Party movement and the John Birch Society. It's actually kind of fascinating that the John Birch Society, as many of you know, has for a long time been anathema even on the right. Bill Buckley famously kind of wrote them out of the movement in an attempt to make conservatism respectable. And yet, slowly, the John Birch Society itself is making a comeback. Recently, there's a show on Fox News called Freedom Watch, and it's on the website. It's hosted by a guy named Justice Andrew Napolitano, a former judge. And what's fascinating about it is that it streams under the Fox imprimatur, but it is actually a little bit more right-wing, even than anything you'd see on Fox. And it kind of goes under the radar because nobody's going to be kind of flipping through and happen upon it unexpectedly. And on Freedom Watch, you'll see, many of the various leaders of various parts of the religious, various sectors of the right-wing movement, but recently the leader of the John Birch Society, who was kind of brought on this show to be rehabilitated, and Andrew Napolitano said something like, I remember learning that you guys were so crazy, but suddenly what you say, it makes a lot of sense. And actually the John Birch Society, there's a conference that happens every year in Washington called CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Committee. And the John Birch Society is this year a co-sponsor of CPAC, which would have been unthinkable even a couple of years ago that CPAC would have associated with them in such a way. And so the John Birch Society, unlike, say, the modern religious right, from my study of the right, from what I've seen of the right, a lot of the impulses are similar, but it waxes and wanes in terms of whether it's mostly defensive and paranoid and has a kind of a negative agenda, and what I mean by a negative agenda is an agenda of stopping liberalism, fighting back against what government is doing. At other times, usually coinciding with Republican administrations, it has a kind of more positive and outgoing and evangelical, in both senses of the word, agenda. So that you had, during the Bush administration, you had a religious right that was actually incredibly optimistic about the role of government, that was incredibly optimistic about its ability to project its views all over the world, and that had a much more kind of proactive agenda as opposed to a reactive agenda. So what you're seeing right now is a return to a version of conservatism that is fairly perennial. And although it doesn't highlight its social conservatism is an absolutely integral part of it. I mean, even Ron Paul, who is kind of, one of the patron saints of the Tea Party movement, and who some people on the left tend to give, I think, much more credit than he deserves because he's right about, because he said some of the right things about the war and his criticisms of American policy in the Middle East. Ron Paul is incredibly anti-abortion. His roots are essentially in the kind of old John Birch style right, which in many cases, is paranoid about the Fed, is paranoid about the New World Order, believes that there's some kind of international conspiracy. It's anti-Semitism without Jews, basically. It's that there's an international octopus, an international octopus of various kind of scheming elitists who are trying to essentially unite a parasitical elite with a parasitical underclass against the kind of wholesome American producers who create most of the wealth in this country. And so what they do, where this fits into the anti-abortion movement is that although if you haven't heard a lot of rhetoric about social issues, there's an inevitable merging of the two movements, and you can see that most obviously with the kind of fame of Sarah Palin, but there's a big convention coming up in February that, although it's controversial itself within the Tea Party movement, because some people object to what they see rightly as the fact that it's simply trying to make money off the movement by charging these kind of astronomical fees and paying insane speaking fees, nevertheless, I think that it will end up being pretty successful. And the speaker list of this movement the speaker list of this conference really shows the extent to which the two movements are explicitly merging. In addition to various Tea Party figures and Sarah Palin, there's Rick Scarborough. Now, for a long time, Rick Scarborough was trying to position himself as the kind of heir to Jerry Falwell and the heir to Pat Robertson. And he's quite a bit actually more radical than either one of them. Among his books are In Defense of Mixing Church and State and Liberalism Kills Kids. Another speaker at the conference is Roy Moore, who some of you might remember. He was famous when he was Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court for putting a huge Ten Commandments monument. He's since then become a cult figure on the right, but again, is really too far to the right, even for most Republicans to associate with openly, at least until very recently. In his judicial opinions, he suggested support for the death penalty for homosexuality, and he's been known to write rhyming poetry about the fact that the United States has forfeited God's grace because of its embrace of abortion. So that's the national right is still, like I said, very inward-looking and very suspicious of foreigners, which is why it's so interesting that at least one sector of it has become incredibly savvy about working internationally, and even with a degree of kind of cosmopolitanism. And actually, I'm just going to grab my book for a second because I want to read a quote. I thought of this when Carole was talking about Flip Benham, and I remember when Flip Benham was going to burn the Quran but couldn't get his fire permit, which, I guess shows an admirable respect for the law. But it's actually not a contradiction. I think if you understand their ideology, that they would see abortion, homosexuality, and Islam as being linked because they have this, kind of Manichaean worldview that we're, approaching the last days and we're in this final battle between, the forces of Christianity and the forces of darkness, and all of those things are allied in the forces of darkness in their worldview. The international anti-abortion movement is naturally quite a bit more sophisticated because what's amazing about them is that they've actually made real alliances with Muslim conservatives for obvious reasons. You know, the Flip Benham, I mean, despite what he may think, actually has much more in common with the Islamic right than he does with liberals in his own country. And, you know, one of the things that I've argued in my book and elsewhere is that the kind of ultimate battle lines that you see in the world today are not so much between East and West or Christianity and Islam as they are between an international network of fundamentalists and an international network of liberals, and that every country in the world has both. You know, and so and in many cases, it's always been obvious to me that the American religious right has more in common ideologically and kind of in terms of their anxieties and their underlying motivations with, say, the regime in Iran than they do with, say, the United Church of Christ or the kind of Lutheran pastors that Carole was talking about. And what drove me to really dive into this subject is that, at least on reproductive rights, they're very explicit about their agreement. So this is a quote from 1994. Some of you might remember that in 1994 there was a big conference in Cairo, the International Conference on Population and Development. And although one of the themes of my book is to try to explain how international conferences and international law has created a kind of globalized reproductive rights movement, and how in many cases reproductive rights have actually moved into the domain of international law, which is very poorly understood here because we don't pay that much attention to international law anyway. We don't think it applies to us. But there's actually been a whole series of quite remarkable precedents, and that have created actually some of the same backlashes on an international scale that we see here with Roe versus Wade. But so this is 1994. It's the run-up to this conference, which is going to be quite historic in terms of establishing reproductive rights as a principle of human rights and kind of getting, under American leadership actually, getting most of the world to sign on to this really remarkable statement about the universality of reproductive rights and that every woman has the right to control her own reproduction. And the Vatican panicked. You know, people who, you know, I've read biographies of Pope John Paul II that said they had never seen, you know, people saying he had never been so upset. They had never seen him so agitated. And naturally he saw that he wasn't going to have a lot of luck in making alliances with other countries in Europe. I should back up. Something that I think people should understand is that the Vatican, of course, is not just a religious body. The Holy See, for all intents and the Holy See is a country, and it has the same privileges in the United Nations as any other country. No other religion has this. But what this means is that this very small entity, whose citizens are overwhelmingly celibate men, you know, have a lot of sway in these UN conferences that by their nature require consensus and kind of willingness to litigate these kind of things in these endless bargaining sessions that would make me want to stab my eyes out with a fork. I mean, you know, people are up till 4:30 in the morning kind of arguing over the most minute kind of legalisms. And it sounds all very kind of recondite and obscure, but it actually, and I tried to show this in my book, ends up having an effect on the lives of women in far-flung corners of the world in some unexpected ways. But so understanding that this was a kind of international battle that really did put the interests of kind of religious fundamentalism and a view of the world that showed truth to be something that was divinely ordained and unchangeable against, you know, the forces of kind of global feminism and modernity and liberalism, the Vatican started sending emissaries to various Islamic countries, and it found a lot of cooperation in Libya, where they promised Gaddafi that if he cooperated with them and stood strong with them, he would help effect a kind of rapprochement with the rest of the world, because this, you know, which Libya's been a pariah since the Lockerbie bombing. And he sent people to Iran, and this is what the deputy foreign minister said. "The future war is between the religious and the materialists. Collaboration between religious governments in support of outlawing abortion is a fine beginning for the conception of collaboration in other fields. Now, you actually don't have much of an anti-abortion movement in a lot of Muslim countries because actually they have quite a different attitude towards the beginning of life, and abortion per se is not the problem in many cases so much as a kind of broader conception of sexual and reproductive health and rights. I mean, you can actually buy the morning after pill in Saudi Arabia, provided that you're married. And, no Islamic country bans abortion in cases when a woman's life is at stake. And that's not true of Catholic countries. Nevertheless, you're kind of seeing an understanding on the part of the American right and the part of kind of global right that their interests are in many ways intertwined. And it's very ironic because so much of the American right is devoted to kind of demonizing Islam, and yet so much of their international activity is devoted to kind of building this ecumenical brotherhood of fundamentalists. To bring this down to earth a little bit, I said before that you've seen reproductive rights move into the realm of international law. And it's kind of a complicated process how that happened because international law itself is such a somewhat vague and inevitable thing that's very much tied to interpretations, and that obviously doesn't have, its enforcement mechanisms are themselves constantly subject to negotiation and debate. But nevertheless, the decisions of international courts often make a real difference. And there's been a number of them in the last few years. There was a case in the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in which a girl, a 17-year-old in Peru, who'd been forced against her will to carry a fetus to term that was missing most of its forebrain and that had no chance of survival. She took the case to the UN and got a ruling that her human rights had been violated and that she was owed some sort of restitution. There was a case before the Inter-American System which was actually settled. It was brought by a young Mexican girl who had been raped, forced to carry the pregnancy to term. The Mexican government settled, agreeing to pay her a stipend and to fund the child's education through college. And then there was a case in Europe a couple of years ago when she had 2 children already, she had an unemployed husband, and she had a lot of medical problems. Her first 2 babies had been delivered by cesarean. She had incredibly bad eyesight and was told by a doctor, she had this unwanted pregnancy, and she was told by a doctor that if she carried it to term, she was likely to go blind. And yet she was denied an abortion. She had the baby, she went blind. She went to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg and got a ruling, again, that her human rights had been violated and that Poland had to pay her, I believe it was 36,000 euros, which is actually kind of rather pitiful price for one's eyesight, but was nevertheless a precedent. And in the case of the European Court of Human Rights is actually an enforceable one. The European Court of Human Rights carries the force of law. Poland has signed a treaty acceding to it. So increasingly, anti-abortion movements realize that their fortunes are linked. And meanwhile, the American anti-abortion movement has realized that it can find both allies and new scope for action overseas. This really started during the Reagan administration, and it's born in, some of the same dynamics are at work in driving the most radical elements of the anti-abortion movement to become much more active during Democratic administrations. Essentially, we see the reason that there are never any shootings during Republican administrations, and that violence kind of inevitably, violence skyrocketed during Clinton, it dropped off entirely for George W. Bush, and then kind of started up again with Obama. I mean, it's quite simple that the movement just sees it has very little scope for action in Democratic administrations, and that frustration builds and it drives a certain number of people to act out in the most extreme ways, whereas they might be able to feel like they can work within the system when they have some allies in government. There's also a sense, though, that even when they have allies in government, there's only so much that they can really do domestically. You know, even though there was a huge change from Reagan, or from Bush to Clinton to Bush to Obama, the change for most women is around the margins. I mean, Roe versus Wade has kind of created a stable status quo, and though there are judicial appointments and regulations and questions about kind of federal funding, most women's lives, especially except for very poor women, most women's reproductive rights don't change radically from one election to another, especially because most of the most intrusive regulations happen at the state level. It's only at the international level that that presidents of both parties have enormous scope for action, and that they can kind of satisfy the most ardent members of their base. So during the Reagan administration, there was, you know, the rest of domestic anti-abortion movement that felt like they had elected this man and weren't getting what they wanted in return. Meanwhile, Reagan had very little interest in actually banning abortion and precipitating a massive backlash. Saw in the international arena a way for him to reward them without anybody else really even noticing, because there's very little attention. I mean, this is about poor countries, this is about women and poor women, and these issues just aren't issues that get any attention whatsoever. And that was really the origins of the Global Gag Rule. And the Global Gag Rule, of course, the Global Gag Rule doesn't just prohibit American money going to groups that also perform abortions. It prohibits American money going to groups that even talk about abortion, that refer for abortions, and it ends up affecting not just healthcare, but really the democratic process in these other countries. For the following reason, traveling, let me see my time. I know only, as someone who was born after Roe versus Wade, I know only from reading, books like Carole's book or, the work of historians, what illegal abortion looks like in practice. Even though when I used to actually do clinic defense at Barnett's Lafayette's clinic when I was in high school, because I grew up in Buffalo, and even though I would, stand out there with a placard with a coat hanger and a cross through it, it was still an abstraction. And I think, it's my tremendous good fortune and the good fortune of my generation that was an abstraction. But this is very much not an abstraction around the world. Almost all of Latin America and almost all of sub-Saharan Africa have very restrictive abortion laws and sometimes outright abortion bans, even when a woman's life is at stake, particularly in Latin America. It's a huge, huge, huge component of maternal mortality worldwide. It's actually astonishing, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. When you go to emergency rooms in big cities, in Nairobi, or not just big cities, in cities period, when you go to the emergency room, the doctors in the OBGYN wards spend most of their time dealing with botched abortions. It takes a huge toll on the health system. And so a couple of years ago, Ethiopia decided to liberalize its very strict anti-abortion law. And there was a big debate, and then all of a sudden, this movement kind of springs up out of nowhere, right? All of a sudden there's protesters with the same kind of signs you see outside of American clinics, and they're in English, they're not in Amharic. It wasn't, a domestic, although there was domestic involvement, the inspiration came from outside of Ethiopia. And as a matter of fact, most of there's groups like Human Life International and a number of other groups that have opened offices in cities all over the world. And so what happened, so you see this kind of this anti-abortion movement modeled very much on the American one. They convinced Parliament to show the silent scream. And, the Ethiopians didn't quite know what hit them, where this was coming from. But there was something that happened simultaneously that had to do with government policy. And that was that the doctors who I'm talking about, who deal with the terrible aftermath of botched abortions, if they were involved in agencies that got any government money, couldn't testify about it. They couldn't advocate for the change in laws. That's why they call it a global gag rule. To advocate for changing these laws would risk huge amounts of money that they legitimately need for other things, because the American government remains, even during the Bush years, the world's major provider of contraception, and simply a kind of 800-pound gorilla in the field of public health. I'm going to quickly wrap this up because usually the questions are the most interesting part of these things. But just to kind of make clear what's going on as we go forward, just as we've seen a kind of retrenchment and a lot of really worrying trends in the States, there's also a backlash internationally that inevitably sees reproductive rights as its kind of first priority. And the reasons for this, I believe, are that there's a really direct connection between women's rights and modernity, women's rights and globalization, women's rights and urbanization, women's rights with, kind of expanding public role for women and equalization of sex differences is one of the first signs of all of these trends. And these trends aren't always universally positive, but nevertheless, they are usually positive in terms of upsetting old gender hierarchies. So it's not surprising that conservative movements and right-wing movements see restoring women to their proper place as being the first step towards towards restoring their dying, a view between restoring a dying kind of world, restoring a world that no longer exists. And so there are anti-abortion movements, like I said, there's, Nicaragua banned all abortion in 2007, with a lot of international involvement actually on both sides. They banned all abortion even when a woman's life is at stake, so that there are now women going to hospitals with ectopic pregnancies and being forced to wait for their fallopian tubes to burst. There are women hemorrhaging to death in hospitals because doctors can't intervene if the fetus has a heartbeat. Nicaragua's maternal mortality rate has doubled since 2007, since this law was introduced. And in Africa, you see often quite similar things. The exporting of both the anti-abortion movement and the anti-gay movement. Some of you might know about how Uganda is on the cusp of adopting a law that would institute the death penalty for homosexuality, although there's reports they've backed off a little bit. The same forces that are out there kind of spreading the idea that there's an international homosexual conspiracy have also been out spreading the idea that there is, it's actually a kind of weird inverted anti-colonialism, because the rhetoric says that, these are kind of white eugenicists who want less Africans and are out to kind of, obliterate your people. So anyway, in Kenya, in Nairobi, a couple of years ago, there was a big study that was done that showed the extent, the toll that illegal abortion and unsafe abortion was taking on their healthcare system. And they were just on the cusp of liberalization. There was a lot of movement in that direction. And then all of a sudden, these fetuses were found out in this kind of dirty little river outside of a Pentecostal church. And the fetuses just happened to have a lot of documentation and information about one of the most prominent gynecologists in Nairobi. And soon him and two of his nurses were arrested, not for abortion, which is a crime, but for murder. And one of the big differences there is that murder isn't bailable, so they spent a year in prison waiting for their trial. When the trial eventually came, forensics found that these babies were not, that these were not fetuses. They were stillborn. They were miscarriages. They were stillborn babies, and that it was incredibly suspicious how this documentation had come to be on them, and the guards at the church who had found them had very kind of conflicting and contradictory and inconsistent stories. And so although there was never any proof that somebody actually stole these bodies and planted them by a river and then kind of railroaded this doctor and created a massive public outcry with a big public funeral and processions through the street. That's really what it looks like. And so some of the same, if not the same tactics, the same level of extremism and the same willingness to do almost anything in the name of stopping what they see as kind of the ultimate abomination is, again, it's not just a problem for us. And I guess with that, I'll finish and turn it over to questions. Thank you very much.
With churches, is it Muslim with churches, is it Catholic with it, around the world, if you have a sense of
Yeah, well, I think, the thing is that Ortega has, Ortega sold out the women's movement a long time ago. But what the specific dynamics in Nicaragua, which are not just unique to Nicaragua, are that, after the revolution, there had been, a lot of female militants. There had been a big female presence. There had been a big female presence in the revolution, and then women kind of came and expected their place in the new government. And there were some changes made and there were some improvements, but one woman told me, who now runs a women's health center, said that, her and some other militants came up with a list of demands and they presented it to Ortega, and he said to them something along the lines of, not until we replace all the murders of the revolution in terms of reproductive rights. And so there had been an estrangement very early on. And then what happened was the women's movement, alienated from the Sandinistas, started forming alliance, started kind of working autonomously. They opened up a lot of women's health clinics, and they found support in an international women's movement. And the women's movement has become kind of increasingly globalized, and there are increasing, there are funds from Scandinavian countries, there are funds from the United Nations. There's this whole trend in international law that I've been talking about. Occasionally, depending on who's in power, there's a lot of support from the United States. And so they became, although they were able to be pretty effective in terms of providing health services, they became a target for all kinds of populist demagogues. So, even before Ortega, there was, I think Ernesto Alemán and other governments would single them out as, these are kind of decadent foreign influences trying to undermine our Nicaraguan culture and bringing a kind of corrupt West. And meanwhile, there really is a kind of corrupt West. So to speak, moving into Nicaragua, there's been a huge increase in, there's, casinos, there's a huge increase in sex tourism. There is this sense of kind of moral disequilibrium and people feeling unmoored. And the women's movement became, a scapegoat for all of that. And so it was very easy then. And then meanwhile, you also had, the end of liberation theology, kind of the clergy becoming much more conservative, American Pentecostalism taking off like crazy all around Latin America, as well as in sub-Saharan Africa, actually even more in sub-Saharan Africa. And so it was just this kind of, it was actually a fairly natural alliance to run a populist campaign against the women's movement, which is associated with the global north and with a kind of international system that people feel somehow abused by.
I was wondering if either of you could talk a little more about the history of the anti-abortion movement in the U.S. and how it came to be. How did abortion become an issue for conservatives?
Okay. How did abortion become the driving issue of American politics? There's several answers. I think the quickest one, since gotta be quick, is a backlash against the social movements of the 60s and 70s. Primarily the women's movement, which was then called the Women's Liberation Movement, which was a much more radical movement than the current incarnation. The gay rights movement, which started in the late 60s, early 70s. As I mentioned in my book, the very first sort of backlash movement against feminism was actually a movement of housewives in churches organized against childcare. Now, I know it might sound bizarre today that childcare could ignite such passions, but one of the first and arguably last victories of 1970 feminism was a childcare bill passed by Congress with the support of many union members, the feminist activists in Washington. Richard Nixon vetoed that bill, pressured by the right wing. A newly forming right wing mobilized hundreds and thousands of housewives in churches across the country, telling them ridiculous lies. The government, I mean, not unlike the kind of rhetoric we're seeing now from the Tea Parties, the government is going to take your children, the government is going to raise your children, you will have to put your children in these child care centers. Nixon in his veto message even referred to the collective approaches to child rearing, which of course was a reference to then Soviet Russia. So that was the first, quote, opening shot in the battle against the family. It didn't work. Too many women were going to work. Roe versus Wade in 1973 was a gift, I don't want to say a gift from heaven, but that's how many in the newly forming right wing saw it. I mean, Roe versus Wade mobilized millions. It brought the resources of the Catholic Church, which were considerable, which still fund, to a large degree, fund this movement. So the quickest way to explain this is that this is a movement, which is not to say there are not sincere people who deeply abhor abortion. Of course there are. But as a political device, it was an extremely useful way to mobilize against, going back to what Michelle said. I mean, this was a way to mobilize against the modernity that Roe versus Wade represented.
Last question?
I'm just wondering if either one of you could talk on more of a current topic of, say, the Obama administration and any goals or any areas in which case they can find success in this the abortion movement or women's rights, either internationally or nationally.
Stuff is so much better internationally than nationally.
Yeah, I mean, they have, one of the things about, there's actually no other issue I can think of that changes so radically from one administration to another because, administrations have so much power to act, kind of unstymied by Congress. And so, day one of the Obama administration, there was radical change in terms of kind of American support for reproductive health care around the world. There was, which I encourage people to Google actually, there was this really astonishing, moment in a House Foreign Relations Subcommittee hearing, which doesn't sound super dramatic, but Chris Smith is the leader of the international anti-abortion movement in the House, was questioning Hillary Clinton about whether the United States was going to try to undermine anti-abortion laws in Latin America and Africa. And she gave this response that was really quite astonishing in its directness. She talked about the toll that she's seen lack of reproductive health care, including abortion, take on women's health around the world. She talked about this really eloquently. And then she basically said to him, you are free to advocate for your point of view around the world, and so are we, and kind of made it clear that the United States, sees abortion as a component of reproductive health care and was going to support its, not the expansion of abortion around the world, but the expansion of access to safe abortion around the world. One of the things you see internationally is that if there is, even though I actually understand quite well people's deep ambivalence about abortion, but this is actually in no way a question of whether or not abortions are going to occur. One of the things you see internationally is that there's not even, is there no correlation? There is, the only correlation between a country's abortion laws and its abortion rates is inverse. The countries with the strictest anti-abortion laws have the highest abortion rates for obvious reasons, because they have less access, because anti-abortion laws inevitably go with less access to family planning, less access to sex education, and the rest. Domestically, I think the picture is much more fraught, as we're seeing with the healthcare debate. So maybe you want to speak to that.
No, the healthcare debate, well, it's not even clear at this moment we're going to have healthcare. I hope we do, but who the hell knows? But what the healthcare debate has done with respect to abortion is an object lesson in exactly the opposite direction that ideally abortion should go. Abortion should be part of normalized health care. One of the wisest sayings ever made in this movement was made by Rachel Atkins, a physician assistant who for many years was head of a women's clinic in Vermont. And she told a New York Times reporter, there are not two women in our waiting room. You know, women who have abortions and women who are here for prenatal care. They're the same women at different points in their life, which is true. Not entirely. Not everybody who has an abortion has children. 84%. The point is that with respect to health reform, all the Stupak Amendment, the Nelson Compromise, what each of these things have done is further culturally marginalize abortion. The Stupak Amendment said that if abortion can't be covered by a national health care plan, you have to buy a separate rider. The Nelson Compromise in the Senate was write 2 separate checks. I mean, if you ever needed evidence of the stigmatized, marginalized place of abortion, there you have it. So at this moment in time, in answer to your question, I'm very hard pressed to think of anything good happening.
That's a bad note, but let me thank you all for coming, and let me thank our speakers who have been extraordinary in my view, and I hope you continue to attend these events. The books will be available for purchase and signing at a price of $17, which I understand to be a bargain, and we encourage you all to see about purchasing the book. Thank you all very much.